She was still attached to the foredrip. The surgical staples holding her side together were less than 48 hours old. She had not yet walked to the bathroom without help. She had given this man a piece of her body, the living tissue of her own organ, to keep him alive when nothing else could. And he walked into her hospital room in his recovery gown, stood at the foot of her bed, and placed an envelope on the blanket near her feet. His mother stood behind him smiling the smile of a woman who had just watched a plan she had constructed over months arrive at its conclusion. The envelope contained divorce papers. His attorney had filed that morning. She looked at the man she had married. She said, "I saved your life." He said he was grateful but that gratitude was not the same as love. Then he walked out. And the woman standing behind him paused at the door and said, "You should have known your place, dear." The door closed. And Adaeze Onyeka lay in that hospital bed with one kidney and no husband and a hole in the center of everything she had believed about love. But what Tobias Kwame and his mother had not calculated, what they had no way of calculating because they had never looked at her father with enough attention to look past what they thought they were seeing, was that the quiet old man in the worn shoes who drove a taxi for a living was sitting in the hospital car park at that exact moment, reading a newspaper through scratched glasses, with a net worth of $850 million. And when he finished reading the newspaper and came upstairs and saw his daughter's face, something in him that had been patient for 30 years stopped being patient. Welcome to Bishop Tales, where every week we bring you powerful, emotional, and unforgettable stories that stay with you long after the video ends. If you are new here, please subscribe right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from tonight. Are you in the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, South Africa, Jamaica, Nigeria, Ghana, or somewhere else in this world? We love hearing from you. Now let us begin. Adaeze Onyeka grew up in a small apartment in a part of the city that did not make it into the photographs that cities use to describe themselves. It was a two-bedroom place on the 4th floor of a building that was older than it should have been, with a lift that worked on alternate Tuesdays and a stairwell that smelled of cooking and the particular accumulated life of people living close together in limited space. Her mother Chidinma had made the apartment feel larger than it was through the particular talent of women who understand that a home is made of attention rather than square footage, keeping it clean and ordered and warm with the smells of food and the sound of gospel music playing softly from the small speaker in the kitchen. Chidinma had taught Adaeze the things that mothers teach daughters when they understand that their daughters will need to navigate a world that is not always gentle. She taught her that kindness given freely was not a loss. She taught her that the people who received your love without caring for it carefully were not a reason to stop loving but a reason to choose more carefully who received it. She taught her that softness was not weakness. She used to hold Adaeze's face in her hands before school each morning and say those words. Softness is not weakness. Softness is the thing that God uses to change the world. She said it with the conviction of someone who had tested the belief against real experience and found it to hold. Chidinma was diagnosed with cancer when Adaeze was 15. The disease moved with the indifference of things that do not care what they interrupt. It moved through the mother over 18 months and Adaeze sat beside the hospital bed for significant portions of those 18 months and watched the woman who had shaped everything she understood about love diminish toward her ending. She held her mother's hand on the last night. She was 16 years old and she was already deciding that she would spend her life in hospitals because hospitals were where the most important things happened and because she needed to be useful to people in the way her mother had been useful to everyone around her. Her father Kofi had managed the aftermath of Chidinma's death with the specific competence of a man who processes grief through action. He cooked and cleaned and showed up at Adaeze's school for every parent meeting in his modest clothes and his manner that was entirely unhurried and attentive in a way that some of the other parents, the ones who came in expensive cars and spoke with the confidence of people whose time was considered valuable, did not manage to be. He drove a taxi. He had always driven a taxi, as far as Adaeze knew. He drove it 7 days a week and occasionally more, and the money it produced was modest but sufficient, and Adaeze never went without anything essential. What Adaeze did not know, would not know until she was 23 and Kofi sat across from her at the kitchen table one evening and told her with the careful deliberateness of a man delivering a truth he has prepared for a long time, was that her father was one of the wealthiest men on the continent. He had founded a mineral resources company in the early 90s with a partner he trusted, had grown it through a period of significant difficulty into something substantial, and had expanded it over 20 years into an operation that employed thousands of people and generated revenues that would have made the people who looked past him at school meetings move very differently in his presence if they had known. He had personal assets worth $850 million. He held a chairman position and a controlling share in a company whose name appeared in international business publications. He was a figure of genuine significance in certain rooms. He had chosen to raise Adaeze as a taxi driver's daughter because Chidinma had asked him to. She had said in her final weeks that money was the thing that broke the most people and that she wanted their daughter to grow up with the values that came from building something yourself rather than inheriting it, to know what work felt like, to understand what things cost, to be kind to people who were not in a position to benefit her. She said, "Let her earn her own way, Kofi. She does not need your money. She needs to become herself." He had honored this. It was the most important promise he had ever kept. Adaeze graduated from medical school in the top quarter of her year and began working as a nurse in the emergency department of a large city hospital, and Kofi watched her from the car park in his taxi on the day she finished her first shift and felt the pride of a man who has done the right thing at significant personal cost. Then Tobias Kwame appeared. He was the kind of man that certain kinds of rooms produce in quantity. Well-proportioned, well-dressed, fluent in the language of success, capable of presenting himself as exactly what a situation required. He worked in corporate finance, which gave him a vocabulary that sounded specific but was actually very broadly applicable. He had the particular charm of someone who has learned that asking questions about the other person and appearing genuinely interested in the answers is one of the most effective social tools available. He deployed this charm on Adaeze at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, and it worked the way it usually worked because Adaeze was a woman who valued genuine interest and found it, as most people do, slightly unusual to encounter in social settings. He was attentive. He was consistent. He sent flowers and made calls and showed up when he said he would show up. He met Kofi twice, once at the small apartment and once at a restaurant, and both times he looked at the worn clothes and the modest manner and the scratched glasses and performed a rapid assessment whose conclusion was that this man was irrelevant to his calculations. He told Adaeze on the drive home that her father seemed like a good man, simple and decent, which was exactly as condescending as it sounds but not so clearly condescending that Adaeze identified it immediately. Kofi heard it when she mentioned it and filed it next to the other things he had noticed about Tobias Kwame during the two meetings, the calculation behind the warmth, the way the warmth turned off when he thought no one important was watching, the specific quality of his attention to Adaeze, which was the attention of a man who is glad to have something rather than the attention of a man who is grateful. Kofi told Adaeze his concern. She heard it as parental caution. They had a gentle disagreement about it that went unresolved, and eventually she stopped raising Tobias in conversation with her father and Kofi stopped raising his concerns with her because he understood that telling a person who has decided to love someone that the decision is wrong is one of the least effective interventions available to a parent. She married Tobias. Small ceremony, honest vows, her father in his best outfit looking at the man taking his daughter's hand with the composed watchfulness of someone who is continuing to gather information. Tobias's mother, a woman named Gloria, attended in expensive clothes and an expression that said she had opinions about the match that she was currently suppressing for strategic reasons. She had told Tobias before the wedding that he was making a mistake, that a nurse from a modest family brought nothing to their name, that there had been other options with better credentials. Tobias had heard this and had decided that Adaeze's beauty and kindness made her sufficient for the time being and that the future was long. The first years of the marriage held a surface adequacy. They lived in a comfortable apartment that Tobias's salary supported. Adaeze worked her hospital shifts and contributed to the household and cooked and maintained the domestic life of the partnership with the thoroughness of someone who had been taught that a home is built through attention and effort. She attended Gloria's family events and received the particular treatment that daughters-in-law receive from mothers-in-law who have never considered them adequate. At a family gathering, Gloria served the dishes of all the other women present and paused at Adaeze's contribution for just a fraction of a second too long before saying something quietly dismissive. Tobias was present. He said nothing. He never said anything when his mother was unkind to his wife. This was not an oversight. It was a position. He had met Priscilla some years earlier, before Adaeze, and Priscilla had returned to the city. She was connected and expensive and moved in circles whose social currency was the kind that Tobias cared about. She made it clear that she was available. He made it clear that this interested him. Within a few months they were conducting an affair that Gloria was aware of and approved of. Gloria and Tobias had quiet conversations about the future. They discussed timing. They discussed what a clean exit from the marriage would require. They were in the process of deciding when to move when Tobias got sick. The diagnosis was kidney disease. Both kidneys were compromised. The deterioration was faster than the standard presentation and the prognosis without intervention was serious. Dialysis was managing the situation but could not manage it indefinitely. He needed a transplant. The urgency of this rearranged Gloria's timeline. She and Tobias agreed that the divorce would follow once he had secured what he needed. In the meantime, the marriage would continue because a wife was more likely to offer an organ than an ex-wife. This was the calculation. They made it deliberately and with the specific coldness of people who have decided that another person's welfare is a resource to be extracted rather than a life to be considered. Gloria was tested and was not a match. Priscilla refused to be tested, citing fear of surgery in a way that suggested she had never actually considered saying yes. The transplant waiting list was long and the timeline was not compatible with long. The transplant coordinator called and told Tobias that his wife was a perfect match. Tobias called Gloria. Gloria said they would proceed as planned. The organ first. Then the divorce. Adaeze did not know any of this. She knew only that her husband needed a kidney and she was a match and she was a nurse who understood what that meant medically and a woman who understood what it meant humanly, and the combination of those two understandings produced a decision that took her approximately 4 minutes to arrive at. She signed the consent forms. She researched the procedure. She arranged her time away from work. She told her ward supervisor, a woman with 30 years in the health system whose name was Sister Beatrice, and Sister Beatrice looked at her with the careful attention of someone who hears what is not being said as clearly as what is being said and asked her whether she was certain. Adaeze said her husband needed her. Sister Beatrice did not press further but she noted the way Adaeze had answered, the sentence that was a statement about obligation rather than an expression of love, and she carried that notation. Kofi was in the waiting room on the day of the surgery. He had driven himself in the taxi. He sat in the plastic chair with his folded hands and his newspaper and the particular stillness of a man whose entire interior life is completely invisible to anyone who has not learned to read it, which was everyone in that waiting room except Adaeze, and Adaeze was in surgery. Before she went in she had sat with him for 20 minutes. He had told her she did not have to do this. She had told him she knew. He had said the man did not deserve it. She had said she was not giving her kidney to the man Tobias was. She was giving it to the man she had married, the version of him she had believed in, the version she needed to be true. Kofi had looked at his daughter and felt simultaneously the enormous pride of a father who has raised someone with a more generous heart than the world deserved and the specific anguish of a man watching that generosity about to be used in a way that will cost her. The surgery was successful in both directions. Tobias received the kidney and his body accepted it with the cooperative efficiency of the new organ finding its purpose. Adaeze's recovery was harder. An infection developed in the incision site and drove her temperature to dangerous levels. She was on 4 antibiotics and close monitoring for 3 days. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her body fought the infection with everything available to it while she lay in the bed and tried to sleep through pain that the medication managed but did not eliminate. Kofi did not leave. He sat in the chair beside her bed for every hour of those 3 days. He slept in the chair. He held her hand when she woke in pain. He talked to her when she was awake and was quietly there when she was not. He ate from the hospital cafeteria when she was asleep and came straight back. He was the specific kind of present that is not about performing presence but about actually being there, which is a different thing, and his daughter felt the difference. Tobias visited once. He stood at the door and asked how she was doing and mentioned that his own recovery was demanding, and then he left. He was there for 11 minutes. He did not touch her hand. He did not say thank you. He went back to his private room where Priscilla had been installed with flowers and a catered meal and a comfort that his mother had arranged and paid for through an account that was not yet anyone's problem. Now, friends, I want to pause here for just a moment. Because if you are watching this and something is tightening in your chest, you are exactly where Bishop Tales means for you to be. Please like this video right now and drop a comment. Tell us, have you ever given everything to someone who treated it as nothing? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do it right now because what happens next in this story is something you have to see all the way to the end. The envelope arrived on a Thursday. 48 hours after Adaeze's condition had been stabilized enough to remove the closest level of monitoring. She was still in the bed. She was still on 4 medication. She had not yet walked the corridor without assistance. Her surgical site was still a source of significant pain. Tobias came in wearing his hospital gown and the particular expression of a man who has made a decision he is not going to revisit. Gloria came in behind him in clothes that said she had dressed for this moment, cream-colored and accessorized, the way a person dresses when they want to feel the weight of their own authority. Tobias placed the envelope on the blanket near Adeeze's feet. She looked at it. She looked at him. She said, quietly, "What is this?" He said his attorney had filed that morning. Divorce papers. She said she did not understand. He said he had been unhappy for a long time and that this was not working and that it was better for both of them. She said she had given him her kidney 2 days ago. He said he was grateful but that gratitude was not love and he owed her honesty. She said, in a voice that was barely above a breath, "I almost died for you." He said he was sorry. He turned and walked toward the door. Gloria followed him. At the door Gloria stopped and looked back at Adeeze with the expression of someone who has arrived exactly where they intended and wants the other person to understand that. She said, "You should have known your place, dear." The door closed. A monitor beeped. A nurse came in and checked the readings and looked at Adeeze's face and understood immediately what had happened without being told and went to find Sister Beatrice, who came within 4 minutes and sat on the edge of the bed and held Adeeze's hand and did not say anything for a while because there was nothing to say that was adequate to the situation and she was experienced enough to know that inadequate speech is worse than deliberate silence. Kofi was in the cafeteria getting tea. He came back upstairs and he looked at his daughter's face and he put the tea down on the bedside table very carefully and he picked up the envelope and he opened it and he stood beside the bed and read every page of the document. 14 pages. He read each one. His face did not change. His breathing did not change. He had spent decades in rooms where significant things were decided and had learned the discipline of receiving information without performing a reaction to it before he had finished receiving it. He finished reading. He put the papers back in the envelope. He set the envelope on the nightstand. He sat down in the chair beside the bed. He took his daughter's hand. He said, "Rest now. Daddy will take care of everything." Adeeze closed her eyes. She had not slept properly in 3 days. The combination of the medication in her father's hand and the specific quality of safety that his presence had always produced in her allowed something in her to release enough for sleep to arrive. Kofi sat beside her until her breathing steadied. Then he stood up. He walked to the window that looked out over the car park. He stood there for a moment. Then he took out his phone, not the modest handset he carried as part of the life he had constructed in this city, but another one, sleeker and newer, which he kept charged in the inside pocket of his jacket and used for a different set of conversations. He scrolled to a number. He pressed it. When the call connected he said his name and that he needed the Houston accounts activated and Raymond on a plane tonight. He ended the call. He put the phone back in his pocket. He looked at his daughter sleeping. The taxi driver was in the chair. The chairman of Onyeka Mineral Holdings was standing at the window. The two had occupied the same body for 30 years. Today, one of them was taking the wheel. 3 things began moving simultaneously, and none of them were accidents. The first thing started with a woman named Chisholm Adaebe. Chisholm was a partner at a law firm that handled, among other things, family and divorce law. She had been 2 years ahead of Adeeze in school. They had not been close friends but they had been the kind of acquaintances who shared a genuine warmth, who would stop when they passed each other and ask the real questions rather than the polite ones, who remembered details about each other's lives. When the intake file arrived on Chisholm's desk with Adeeze's name as the respondent in a divorce filing submitted by a client of the firm, Chisholm stared at it for 30 seconds. Then she picked up the phone. She called Adeeze and told her what was in front of her and told her not to sign anything and not to respond to anything and to get her own attorney before she did anything else. She filed a conflict of interest disclosure with her partners within the hour. She could no longer be involved in the case. But she had given Adeeze the most important 30 seconds of information available. The attorney Chisholm recommended was named Blessing Onyeka. Blessing had been practicing family law for 22 years and had the specific quality of someone who has seen every version of every situation and has processed the seeing into a kind of unshakable competence. She reviewed the divorce filing and then she reviewed the circumstances and then she looked at Adaeze and said that Tobias's attorney had filed a document requesting significant assets under an argument that the marriage was of insufficient duration to warrant equitable distribution. She said this was a position she found almost amusing given the circumstances. She said that a kidney donation made during a marriage, particularly one made under conditions where the recipient was simultaneously planning the donor's replacement, constituted a category of marital contribution that Texas courts did not take lightly. She said she was going to file a countersuit that would make Tobias's attorney want to change careers. She said she was looking forward to it. The second thing started with the hospital's administration. A routine billing review flagged an irregularity. A private suite had been charged to the insurance account that covered Tobias during his recovery, a charge of significant value, and the authorization form bore Gloria's signature. The suite was not Tobias's suite. It was an additional suite on a different floor whose occupant was listed as a friend of the patient. The charges included catered meals and a private nursing assistant and daily deliveries and a separate cosmetic consultation that had no relationship to any surgical procedure performed at this facility. The total of the irregular charges was over $40,000, billed to the joint marital insurance account that covered both Tobias and Adaeze because they were still legally married at the time. The hospital administrator referred the matter to the facility's legal team within 24 hours of its discovery. The legal team referred it to the city's financial crimes unit within another 48. Gloria received a formal communication from investigators within the week. She had not anticipated this. She had believed that the transaction was small enough and structured enough to pass unnoticed. She had believed this incorrectly. The third thing started with Raymond. Raymond Amenkwa was the chief legal counsel of Onyeka Mineral Holdings and had been for 20 years. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and the particular composure of someone who has spent 2 decades in rooms where the stakes were high and has learned to be the calmest person present because calmness is a strategic advantage. He had represented the company before international arbitration panels. He had negotiated resource agreements with national governments. He had the kind of record that made the opposition's legal team take a careful breath when his name appeared on opposing filings. He landed at the international terminal at 11:40 in the evening and Kofi was waiting in the taxi. They drove through the city for an hour while Kofi told him everything. Raymond listened without interrupting, which was something he had trained himself to do because the information that people offer when they are not being interrupted is always more complete than the information produced under questions. When Kofi finished, Raymond asked one question. He said, "What do you want?" Kofi said he wanted his daughter protected and the house she had been living in transferred to her name and the financial settlements that Tobias had intended to avoid paid in full and the dignity that had been taken from her in a hospital bed returned in a form that Tobias and his mother would understand clearly and remember specifically. Raymond said he understood. He asked whether Kofi was prepared to reveal himself, to stop being the taxi driver and become what he actually was. Kofi gripped the steering wheel. He said Chidinma had made him promise to let Adaeze live a normal life. He said Chidinma had also told him to protect their daughter. He said Tobias and his mother had served his daughter divorce papers while she was still bleeding from saving her husband's life. He said the patience was finished. Raymond said, "Then let us be precise about it." The settlement meeting was scheduled 3 weeks later and convened in a conference room in the center of the city. Tobias arrived with his attorney expecting to formalize what he anticipated would be a straightforward conclusion. He expected to see a woman still diminished by what she had been through, still without adequate legal representation, still operating from the position of someone who did not have the resources to fight. He expected to be done by lunch. Adaeze walked in first. She had lost weight but she moved with her shoulders back and her face composed, the composure not of someone performing strength but of someone who is actually held by something solid. Behind her came Blessing Onyeka in a dark suit with a briefcase and the expression of someone who has already reviewed every piece of information relevant to the next 2 hours and found it to be deeply in her client's favor. Behind Blessing came a man Tobias did not recognize, tall and gray-haired in a suit that communicated a different category of resources than Tobias was accustomed to seeing walk into a room. The man carried a briefcase and sat down without introducing himself. And then Kofi walked in. Tobias's first response was the habitual one of a man who has processed this person for years as a background figure. The taxi driver. The old man in the modest clothes. Except Kofi was not wearing modest clothes today. He was in a 3-piece suit in deep charcoal with the kind of fit that is not produced by an off-the-rack purchase. His shoes were Italian. His watch was the watch of a man who does not buy things to signal wealth but who buys things that are excellent because excellence is a standard he has maintained for 30 years. His glasses were titanium framed. His posture was the posture of a man who has sat at the head of many significant tables. Everything about him was the same and everything about him was completely different, and the difference was that Tobias was now looking at him without the filter of his own assumption. Tobias said Kofi's name with the uncertain quality of a man who is not sure what he is addressing. Kofi sat down. He looked at Tobias with an expression that was not anger. It was more difficult than anger. It was the complete and undramatic clarity of a man who has been patient for a very long time and has now decided what the situation requires. Raymond introduced himself. He named his firm and his position. He slid a single sheet across the table. It was a financial profile of Onyeka Mineral Holdings. Annual revenue. Total assessed value. Chairman. Kofi Onyeka. Tobias picked it up. He read it. He read it again. The number looked different each time. He looked at Kofi. He looked back at the paper. He said, "That is not possible." Kofi said nothing. He sat and looked at Tobias with the patience of a man who has waited 30 years to say what he was about to say and is in no particular rush about the saying of it. He said, "You looked at me and saw an old man in a taxi. You looked at my daughter and saw a nurse from a modest family. You took her kidney while you were making plans with another woman. And when she was still bleeding from the surgery that saved your life, you sent your mother into her hospital room to smile while you served her the papers." He paused. "You thought you understood what you were looking at. You thought the calculation was simple." He leaned forward slightly. "You were wrong about everything." Raymond proceeded with the precision of a man who has prepared this carefully and knows exactly where it goes. He outlined Gloria's fraud investigation and the charges being prepared by the Financial Crimes Unit. He outlined the countersuit and the legal basis for extraordinary marital sacrifice and the 6 precedents Blessing had identified in Texas case law. He outlined the internal review that had been initiated at Tobias's firm following an inquiry from a significant potential client regarding ethical standards. He described the terms of the settlement that were on the table. The house. The joint investment accounts. 5 years of financial support. And he described the alternative, which was a trial with full media coverage of the circumstances, which were objectively the kind of circumstances that media covers with enormous appetite. He closed his briefcase. He said they were not in a hurry. The room was quiet. Tobias's attorney stared at the financial profile. He looked at his client. He shook his head once, slowly. He said, "Tobias, sign." Tobias looked at Adaeze. She was sitting with her hands folded on the table, not performing anything, not performing anger and not performing graciousness. She was simply there, the woman who had given him the organ that was currently keeping him alive, looking at him with the clear eyes of someone who knows exactly what has happened and has already decided what comes next and is not asking for his understanding of it. He looked at Kofi. Kofi held his gaze with the steady attention of a man who has nothing to prove and nothing to conceal. Something in Tobias's face broke. Not dramatically. Not with noise. A quiet collapse of something that had been held up by calculation and was now without the calculation to sustain it. He thought about the day she had walked down the aisle toward him. He thought about the consent forms she had signed. He thought about the 4 minutes it had taken her to decide that his life was worth her kidney. He thought about what he had done with that decision. And for the first time in the entirety of their relationship he understood what he had had and what he had done with it. He signed every page. He did not speak. His attorney collected the documents. The meeting concluded. People gathered their things and moved toward the door. As Adaeze passed her father he reached out and briefly touched her shoulder, just that, and she stopped and stood beside him for a moment and then they walked out together. 6 months passed. Adaeze was at her kitchen window when the morning sun made the room gold. The kitchen was hers now, in the house that was hers, the settlement holding in the clean way that things hold when they have been constructed properly by competent people. Her scar had faded to a thin silver line that she looked at sometimes in the bathroom mirror and felt something that was not bitterness. It was more like the feeling of a document, evidence of something that had happened, evidence of a decision she had made with a whole heart even when the heart was directed at someone who did not deserve it. She was back at work. Her patients at the hospital called her by her first name in the way that patients call the nurses they trust, the ones who come back after their shift's end to check on them, the ones who sit down rather than standing at the foot of the bed, the ones who remember not just the diagnosis but the person carrying it. Sister Beatrice had submitted her name for the hospital's recognition award, which she did not know about yet and which would make her cry in the quiet way that unexpectedly received kindness produces tears. Kofi came for Sunday dinner every week. He came in the taxi. He wore the dashiki. He sat at her kitchen table and ate what she cooked with the complete appreciation of a man for whom the meal is entirely beside the point. She had asked him once why he still drove the taxi. He had said, because your mother fell in love with a taxi driver and I promised her I would never become someone she wouldn't know. She had cried at this, not sadly, the way you cry when something is exactly right and the exactness of it reaches past your ability to manage it. Gloria had been charged with insurance fraud. The process moved through the system with the unhurried thoroughness of legal consequences that are well documented and clearly supported by evidence. She received a financial penalty and community service and a probation period, and her name appeared in local news in a way that produced specific consequences in the social circles she had maintained. Several of the women she had known for years through charity functions and society events became unavailable after the publication. She had built her life around being someone whose position was unassailable, and the position had turned out to be built on something she had not examined carefully enough. Tobias lost his position at the firm. The review concluded that the circumstances of his personal conduct during the marriage, specifically the acceptance of a life-saving organ from a spouse he was simultaneously planning to divorce, demonstrated a pattern of deliberate deception that was inconsistent with the ethical standards the firm maintained. He was given a severance and escorted from the building, and the news moved through his professional network with the speed that damaging information about public-facing professionals always moves. Priscilla was gone before the month ended. She had positioned herself beside a successful banker, and the successful banker was no longer the description that applied. She left with the things she had brought and returned to her previous life and was not heard from again in this story. Tobias tried once to call Adaeze. The number was no longer connected. He tried to find Kofi at the taxi rank where the taxi was sometimes parked. The other drivers said Kofi had gone to Ghana for an extended period. Tobias stood on the pavement outside the rank in clothes that no longer fit with the precision they once had and looked at the empty space where the old man's taxi sometimes sat and understood, in the complete and irreversible way that understanding arrives when it is too late to use, what he had forfeited. Not the assets. Not the settlement money. What he had forfeited was a person who had decided he was worth a kidney. A person whose love had been the kind that does not calculate. The kind that simply gives. He had held that, and he had exchanged it for something that had already left him, and the exchange rate of that transaction was going to compound for the rest of his life. Adaeze walked into a hospital room on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a room she had been in before under different circumstances. A young woman was in the bed, recovering from a procedure, scared in the specific way of people who are alone in hospitals and do not know what comes next. Adaeze pulled the chair close. She sat down. She took the young woman's hand. She said, "You are going to be okay. I am here and I am going to take care of you." The young woman looked at her the way patients look at nurses who mean it, with a relief so total that it briefly overrides the pain. She said, "Thank you." Adaeze smiled. Not the smile that performs warmth. The smile that is warmth. The smile her mother had given her every morning for 15 years before school, the one that did not ask for anything back, the one that simply gave. Chidinma had been right. Softness is not weakness. Softness is the thing that changes the world. And the people who give with a whole heart are not destroyed by those who take without gratitude. They are clarified by them. Made more specifically themselves. Returned, eventually, to the life they should have been living all along, held by the people who have always known exactly who they were. Kofi sat in his taxi in Accra on a warm evening, on the phone with his board, giving a direction with the quiet precision of a man who has been doing this for 3 decades. He finished the call and sat for a moment in the parked car and looked at the street outside, the particular life of it, the movement and the noise and the ordinary commerce of people going about their days. He thought about Chidinma. He thought about the promise he had kept and the promise that had required him to break the other one. He thought about his daughter in her kitchen in the morning light. He thought about the taxi driver and the chairman and the 30 years of managing the distance between them. He thought that Chidinma would have had something precise and true to say about all of it. He thought she probably already knew. He started the engine. He had somewhere to be. If this story reached you tonight, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like this video right now and subscribe to Bishop Tales for powerful emotional stories every single week. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from, and tell us this. Have you ever given something irreplaceable to someone who did not understand what they had? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one and your story matters. There are many more stories coming to this channel and they go even deeper than this one. Thank you for watching Bishop Tales. We will see you in the next story.